So before I go through the book, we have to understand this book. There's two sort of ghostwriters, editors behind this book. So the first one is Professor G. Arsener. He's an art historian from the University of Oxford. The Dr. Thokmay, he is the primary translator of His Holiness. So these two people are behind this book, who wrote the book. His Holiness give kind of verbal introductions, maybe the contents verbally, that these people were who finally decide what kind of languages, what kind of terms they used. So that's quite important. When you read the book, these two are behind this book. Also, we need to appreciate the hard work of these two authors. Next one, please. So before go through these details, maybe many of you already listened to many of your big book talks about this particular book. So I want to go quite different ways, different directions. Before we touch the book, I think many of you come across these kind of terms into that book. The first one is the protectorate. Because I pick up this book, this term is quite complex and also somehow is problematic as well. So as I said before, there's two editors, two writers. So we have to understand that when you read this book, these books write in a very particular time, kind of particular authors with a particular condition. So these kind of particular terms are used in this book, but sometimes it doesn't really give the whole meaning. Is compared with the Tibetan language. If you suppose if His Holiness himself give an instruction, it might be quite slightly different. What does really this means? That's the sort of words you have to understand. The second one is the priest pattern. Normally, in this book, I think this book is primarily read for those people, for easy readers. People make it easy. So they often use the second priest pattern, could be the correct term, but many times they use the first term, protectorate. That's like a very modern political term. So traditional term should be the second one. That's something you keep in mind. The third one is suzerainty. Suzerainty, as many of you know, that's very much a colonial kind of modern political term, comes with a very definite meanings. But when you define the Tibetan history back in 13th, 14th century, this term doesn't really define the exact condition of the relationship between Tibet and whatever the empire, Ming or Qing empires. So those are the things you keep in mind. The third one is nation. So in this book, a couple of times, they refer to China as a nation. But we have to remember that China was a nation. China never been a nation. They tried to be a nation. In the past, China was an empire, multi-ethnic empire. The current China is a state. They try hard to be a nation. That's why now they get rid of all different languages, get rid of all different differences. They try to create one ethnic city, like one China nation, but they never been a nation. So sometimes this book, sometimes they use China, refer to China as a nation. That's also something you keep in mind. Can you go to the next slide? The another one is a theocratic rule. That's a very Eurocentric kind of a terminology, referred to the combination of church and political powers. So some of Western scholars refer to the role of His Holiness, the historical role of His Holiness as a theocratic role. But we have to understand that this is a very content issue. But that's very different from the European version of a theocratical role compared with the Tibetan government role, historic Tibetan government role. Here I'm referring to the Golden Porter government, historic Golden Porter government. That's quite different from European version of a theocratic role. The second one is not important. The third one, the Inner Mongolia, East Turkestan. So normally in this book, many of times, if you still remember, they always call East Turkestan, then in a comma, they call Xinjiang. But in Mongolia, they never use South Mongolia, they always use Inner Mongolia. So as you know, we don't have any Mongolian people here. Otherwise, Mongolia nowadays, the historically correct term is Southern Mongolia. So that's something to keep in mind. They use the East Turkestan correct term, but they use Inner Mongolia all the time. throughout this book. Those are the kind of critical approach when you look at these books. But you have to remember that this is not something, I'm not saying this is like a kind of, when you read a book, it's really important, just read the verbal level. You have to understand what it does really means behind what these terminologies apply to when it comes to the modern political situations. Can I go next? Shall I go quite quicker, or shall I stop here? I have some passages through the chapters.
Go, take your time.
Okay. Then the first chapter, I keep it short, okay? On the first chapter, that's my issue here. If you read the first chapter, you come across this particular term. So, ideally, if you're not familiar with the Tibetan historical relationship between Tibet and the Qin Empire, the protectorate, if you understand the protectorate meaning, is a modern political science, then you understand, Tibet might be a part of, under the protection of the Manchu Empire. It means that Tibetan is a lesser power than Manchu power in the political, this hierarchical power order. But that's not the case. If we write correctly, condition is this should be the priest pattern level. Priest pattern means there is no hierarchical political order, but there's a different power. One of a secular power, one is a religious power. Powers are equal, but different spheres, different levels of power. So but they use that protectorate term. That's I mentioned that term before. Can you go next chapter? Then chapter 4, I think chapter 4 is very important. This is kind of very powerful message for all Tibetans. Many Tibetans, even among my friends, said after His Holiness, it's very important. Because why? Because people said, because he's a spiritual leader. He's kind of, he's the one who we look up to. But they often miss the symbolic importance of His Holiness. His Holiness really represents Tibetan power, Tibetan legacy, Tibetan history. That's why Chairman Mao said, if His Holiness ran away, then he said, we have lost. That's a very powerful, very short word. That's a very powerful, historically very powerful term. Because he left, he took the old legacy, legitimacy. That's why Chinese government is still struggling to claim that legacy or authority over Tibet. Next, please. The next one, many of, if it's a theocratical society, common people do not have a right to criticize the leader because he's a divine authority. You cannot criticize. But in this book, His Holiness himself, except as when he gave the Strasbourg proposal, for the first time he proposed Tibetan could stay under the rule of China if Tibet get certain rights. So among Tibetans, many people criticize to His Holiness. That's the beauty, because His Holiness is not a theocratical ruler. Someone you cannot criticize. Among Tibetans, they also criticize to him. That's why even he mentioned that in his book. Those are quite important. Could you please go next one? Then the next one is, that's important, because His Holiness, in 1991, he said publicly that, because start from 1980s, he said, if we Chinese government sort of given a certain compromise, we can stay within the role of the People's Republic of China. At the time, His Holiness was the leader of Tibet, so we give a verbally kind of acceptance to the certain level of a role of China. But in 1991, he said, I'm no longer bounded to that acceptance. In case if you come to a debate, some people said, your political leader already accept that certain roles, so those are the important. He is no longer bound to that roles, because China said they never respond any of those proposals. Could you please go next one? The chapters are in the corner if you want to go to the book. So this is, again, as a kind of powerful message. His Holiness said we have a very powerful Tibetan central government in exile. In another way, we have a very kind of large number of populations all over the country. So even we need to stay another couple of years, couple of decades, maybe one century, but still we could be remain as a very, very strong community in exile. Those are the quite powerful messages for me. Next one, please. Okay, I think that is quite important as well. Those are even among this is one thing, even among my friends and my circle, people say, oh, after His Holiness passed away, then we don't have any hope. So His Holiness gave himself that it's really Tibet, I mean, His Holiness institution, if you know the history, Dalai Lama's institution, at the maximum from the fifth Dalai Lama, was a couple hundred years. Tibet been first empire, then sometimes kingdom, fragmented country, different levels. Is many thousand years, historically 1,000 years. That's why we should remember his messages. If we remain strong, remain united, fight for even, I think as His Holiness hope to us, even after him, we still could be continuous, goes be strong, and then maybe fifth Dalai Lama come over, then continue the freedom struggle. Can you go to the next one, please? So this is a quite important one, because if you go through this, you feel like this. If you read this sentence like just abstract, you feel like, okay, Tibet might be under Yuan dynasty because he used that achieved independence from the Mongols. Independent, they use that terminology. That whoever this kind of again related with editors, authors. So in this context, it doesn't really mean we're completely under the Yuan dynasty. We used to have a very strong priest-patron relationship. We used to have a very powerful influence. In certain ways, we used to pay certain form of tax as a tribute, but we're not completely under the rule because we are ruled through for Dromgun Chuja Papa, one of Saka Lama. We are ruled indirectly, not directly under the rule of Yuan dynasty. That is something important. Next one, please. Again, during the Qin Empire, again they used that term domain. I don't really means what exactly meaning of domain in this particular area, but you have remember, as I said before, the relationship between the Qin Empire and the Golden Portal government is a priest pattern. They have plenty of evidence, historic evidence for both in Chinese language, Manchu language, Mongol language, Tibetan languages. So the relationship between Manchu and Tibet is a priest and a pattern. It's certain called this Manchu empire give a kind of secular and military protection. Tibetan Buddhist lamas give Manchu empire a spiritual kind of supporter to support Manchu emperor's sort of emanation of Manchuria. Also, Manchu emperors sent also Tibetan lamas as a political representative to Mongol areas to negotiate any different kind of deals. So they have both benefits. It doesn't mean one is under the rule of another. Last one, please. I think that's so. In this entire book, there's only 4 kind of chapters that you have to read carefully. Rest is more or less a kind of story. So the 5th chapter is very important. He gives a really brief kind of a geopolitical reflection of entire Tibetan issue in kind of world stage. That's a really important chapter. The chapter 15 is the current situation, what we could have done, what we should do in the future. That's a really important one. Then 16th chapter is very important. 16 and the Appendix A is very important, especially for the Tibetan activists, normal Tibetan people who normally often come across other people to conversations to merely simplify how Tibet and China is a difference. So those last 2 chapters very simplified the relationship between Tibet and China, why they are different, what we are fighting for. So those two are very important. Thank you so much. That's all.